Chapter 25. It was dusk on the following day when Padishar and Morgan Lee finally reached the Jut. Both were exhausted. They had travelled hard since leaving Tersis, stopping only for meals. They had slept less than 6 hours the previous night. Nevertheless, they would have arrived even sooner and in better condition, if not for Padishar's insistence on doing everything possible to disguise their trail. Once they entered the Palmer Key, he backtracked continuously, taking them down ravines, through riverbeds, and over rocky outcroppings, all the while watching the land behind him like a hawk. Morgan had thought the outlaw chief overcautious, and after growing impatient enough, had told him so. "Shades, Padishar, we're wasting time. Well, what do you think is back there anyway?" "Nothing we can see, lad," had been the other's enigmatic reply. It was a sultry evening, the air heavy and still, and the skies hazy where the red ball of the sun settled into the horizon. As they rose in the basket lift toward the summit of the Jut, they could see night shadows begin to fill the few wells of daylight that still remained in the forest below, turning them to pools of ink. Insects buzzed annoyingly about them, drawn by their body sweat. The swelter of the day lay across the land in a suffocating blanket. Padishar still had his gaze turned south towards Tersis, as if he might spy whatever it was he suspected had followed them. Morgan looked with him, but as before, saw nothing. The big man shook his head. "I can't see it," he whispered, "but I can feel it coming." He didn't explain what he meant by that, and the Highlander didn't ask. Morgan was tired and hungry, and he knew that nothing either Padishar or he did was likely to change the plans of whatever might be out there. Their journey was completed. They had done everything humanly possible to disguise their passing, and there wasn't anything to be gained by worrying now. Morgan felt his stomach rumble, and the thought of dinner that would be waiting. Lunch that day had been a sparse affair. A few roots, stale bread, hard cheese and some water. "I realize that outlaws are supposed to be able to subsist on next to nothing, but surely you could have done better than this," he had complained. "This is pathetic." "Oh, surely, lad," the outlaw chief had replied, "and next time you be the grave digger and I'll be that body." Their differences had been put aside by then, not forgotten perhaps, but at least placed in proper perspective. Padishar dismissed their confrontation 5 minutes after it ended, and Morgan had concluded by the end of the day that things were back to normal. He bore a grudging respect for the man, for his brash and decisive manner, because it reminded the Highlander of his own, for the confidence he so readily displayed in himself, and for the way he drew other men to him. Padishar wore the trappings of leadership as if they were his birthright, and somehow that seemed fitting. There was undeniable strength in Padishar. It made you want to follow him. But Padishar understood that a leader must give something back to his followers. Acutely aware of Morgan's role in bringing the Valemen north, he had made a point of acknowledging the legitimacy of the Highlanders' concern for their safety. Several times after their argument, he had gone out of his way to reassure Morgan that Parr and Olmsford would never be abandoned, that he would make certain that they were safe. He was a complex, charismatic fellow, and Morgan liked him, despite a nagging suspicion that Padishar would never in the world be able to deliver everything he promised. Outlaws clasped Padishar's hand in greeting at each station of their ascent. If they believed so strongly in him, Morgan asked himself, shouldn't I? But he knew that belief was ephemeral as magic. He thought momentarily of the broken sword he carried, Belief in magic falls as one, layered into iron, then shattered. He took a deep breath. The pain of his loss was still there, deep and insidious, despite his resolve to put it behind him, to do as Padishar had suggested, and to give himself time to heal. There was nothing he could do to change what had happened. He had told himself he must get on with his life. He had lived for years without the use of the sword's magic, without even knowing it existed. He was no worse off now than he had been then. He was the same man. And yet the pain lingered. It was an emptiness that scraped the bones of his body from within, leaving him fragmented and in search of the parts that would make him whole again. He could argue that he was unchanged, but what he had experienced through wielding of the magic had left its stamp upon him, as surely as if he had been branded by a hot iron. The memories remained, the images of his battle, the impressions made by the power he had been able to call upon, the strength he had enjoyed. It was lost to him now, like the loss of a parent or a sibling or a child, could never be completely forgotten. He looked out across the Palmer Quay and felt himself shrinking away to nothing. When they reached the jug, Shandos was waiting. Padishar's one-eyed second-in-command looked larger and blacker than Morgan remembered. His bearded, disfigured face furrowed and lined, wrapped in a great cloak that seemed to lend his massive body added size. He seized Padishar's hand and gripped it hard. "Good hunting?" "Dangerous would be a better word for it," the big man replied shortly. Shandos glanced at Morgan. "The others?" "They've fought their last, save for the Valeman. Where's Hirehone? Somewhere about or gone back to Varfleet?" Morgan glanced quickly at him. So Padishar was still looking to discover who had betrayed them, he thought. There had been no mention of the master of Kilton Forge since Morgan had reported seeing him in Tersus. "Hirehone?" Chandos looked puzzled. "He left after you did, same day. Went back to Varfleet like you told him." "He's not here." He paused. "You have visitors, though?" Padishar yawned. "Visitors?" "Trolls, Padishar." The outlaw chief came awake at once. "You don't say. Trolls? Well, well. And how do they come to be here?" They started across the bluff toward the fire. Padishar and Shandos shoulder to shoulder, Morgan trailing. "They won't say," Shandos said. "Came out of the woods 3 days back, easy as you please. As if finding us here wasn't any trouble at all for them. Came in without a guide, found us like we were camped in the middle of a field with our pennants flying." He grunted. 20 of them, big fellows, down out of the North Country, the Charnels. Celtic Rock, they call themselves. Just hung about until I went down to talk to them. Then asked to speak with you. When I said you were gone, they said they'd wait." "No. Is that so? Determined, are they?" "Like falling rock looking to reach level ground. I brought them up when they agreed to give over their arms. Didn't seem right leaving them sitting down on the Palmer Quay when they'd come all the way to find you, and done such a good job of it in the bargain." He smirked within his beard. "Besides, I figured 300 of us ought to be able to stop a handful of trolls." Padishar laughed softly. "Doesn't hurt to be cautious, old friend. Takes more than a shove to bring down a troll. Where are they?" "Over there. The fire on the left." Morgan and Padishar peered through the gloom. A cluster of faceless shadows were already on their feet, watching their approach. They looked huge. Unconsciously, Morgan reached back to finger the handle of his sword, remembering belatedly that a handle was just about all he had. "The leader's name is Axine," Chandos finished, his voice deliberately low now. "He's the Maturin." Padishar strode up to the trolls, his wariness shed somewhere back, his tall form commanding. One of the trolls stepped forward to meet him. Morgan Lee had never seen a troll. He had heard stories about them, of course. Everyone told stories about the trolls. Once, long before Morgan was born, trolls had come down out of the Northland, their traditional home, to trade with the members of the other races. For a time, some of them had even lived among the men of Callahorn, but all that ended with the coming of the Federation and its crusade for Southland domination. Trolls were no longer welcome below the Strellerheim, and the few who had come south quickly went north again. Reclusive by nature, it took very little to send them back to their mountain stronghold. Now, they never came out. Or at least no one Morgan knew had ever heard of them coming out. To find a band this far south was very unusual. Morgan tried not to stare at the visitors, but it was hard. The trolls were heavily muscled, almost grotesque, their bodies tall and wide, their skin nut brown and rough like bark. Their faces were flat and nearly featureless. Morgan couldn't find any ears at all. They wore leather and heavy armour, and great cloaks lay scattered about their fire like discarded shadows. "I'm Baron Creel, leader of the movement," Padishar's voice boomed out. The troll facing him rumbled something incomprehensible. Morgan caught only the name Axine. The two gripped hands briefly. Then Axine beckoned Padishar to sit with him at their fire. The troll stepped aside as the outlawed chief and his companions moved into the light to seat themselves. Morgan glanced about uneasily as the massive creatures closed about. He had never felt so unprotected. Chandos seemed unconcerned, positioning himself behind Padishar. Morgan eased down next to him. The talk began in earnest then, but the Highlander didn't understand any of it. It was all done in the guttural language of the trolls, a language of which Morgan knew nothing. Padishar seemed comfortable with it, however, pausing only infrequently to consider what he was saying. There was a great deal of what sounded like grunting, some heavy slurs, and much of what was said was emphasized by sharp gestures. "How does Padishar speak their language?" Morgan whispered early on to Chandos. The other never even glanced at him. "We see a bit more of life in Callahorn than you Highlanders," he said. Morgan's hunger was threatening to consume him, but he forced it from his mind, holding himself erect against encroaching weariness, keeping himself deliberately still. The talk went on. Padishar seemed pleased with its direction. "They want to join us," Chandos whispered after a time, apparently deciding that Morgan should be rewarded for his patience. He listened some more. "Not just a few, an entire 21 tribes." He grew excited. 5,000 men. They want to make an alliance. Morgan grew excited himself. "With us? Why?" Chandos didn't answer right away, motioning for Morgan to wait. Then he said, "The movement has approached them before and asked them to help, but they always believed it too divided, too undependable. They've changed their minds of late." He glanced over briefly. "They say Padishar has pulled the separate factions together sufficiently to reconsider. They're looking for a way to slow the Federation advance on their homelands." His rough voice was filled with satisfaction. "Shades, what a stroke of good fortune this might turn out to be." Axine was passing out cups now, and filling them with something from a great jar. Morgan took the cup he was offered and glanced down. The liquid it contained was pitch black. He waited until both the troll leader and Padishar saluted, then drank. It was all he could do to keep from reaching. Whatever he had been given tasted like bile. Shandos caught the look on his face. "Troll milk," he said and smiled. They drained the offering, even Morgan, who found it curbed his appetite in a way he would not have thought possible. Then they rose. Exine and Padishar shook hands once more, and the Southlanders moved away. "Did you hear?" Padishar asked quietly as they disappeared into the shadows. Stars were beginning to wink into view overhead, and the last of the daylight had faded away. "Did you hear it all? The whole of it?" "Every last word," Shandos replied, and Morgan nodded wordlessly. 5,000 men! Shades! We could challenge the best that the Federation had to offer if we had a force like that. Padishar was ecstatic. There might be 2,000 and some that the movement could call upon, and more than that from the dwarves. Shades! He slammed his fist into his open palm, then reached over and clapped both Shandos and Morgan heartily on the back. "It's about time. Something went our way. Wouldn't you agree, lads?" Morgan had dinner after that, sitting alone at a table near the cooking fire, his appetite restored by the smells that emanated from the stew kettles. Padishar and Shandos had gone off to confer on what had been happening during the former's absence, and Morgan saw no need to be a part of that. He looked about for Steph and Teal, but there was no sign of either, and it wasn't until he had almost finished eating that Steph appeared out of the darkness and slumped down beside him. "How did it go?" the dwarf asked perfunctorily, foregoing any greeting. His gnarled hands clutched about a tankard of ale he had carried over. He looked surprisingly worn. Briefly, Morgan related the events of the past week. When he had finished, Steph rubbed at his cinnamon beard and said, "You're lucky to be alive, any of you." His scarred face was haggard-looking. The mix of half-light and shadows seemed to etch more deeply in its lines. "There's been some strange happenings taking place while you were away." Morgan pushed back his plate and looked over, waiting. The dwarf cleared his throat, glancing about before he spoke. "Teal took sick the same day you left. They found her collapsed by the bluff about noon. She was breathing, but I couldn't bring her awake. I took her inside and wrapped her in blankets and sat with her for most of the week. I couldn't do anything for her. She just lay there, barely alive." He took a deep breath. "I thought she'd been poisoned." His mouth twisted. "Could have been, it seemed to me. Lots in the movement have no use for the dwarves. But then she woke finally, reaching and so weak she could barely move. I fed her broth to give her back her strength, and she came around finally. She doesn't know what happened to her. She said that the last thing she remembered was wondering something about Hirehone." Morgan's sharp intake of breath stopped him. "That means something to you, Morgan?" Morgan nodded faintly. "It might. I thought I saw Hirehone and Tursus after we arrived there. He shouldn't have been there, and I decided then that I must have been mistaken. I'm not so certain now. Someone gave us over to the Federation. It could have been Hirehone." Steph shook his head. "Doesn't sound right. Why Hirehone, of all people? He could have turned us in that first time in Varfleet. Why wait until now?" The stocky form shifted. "Besides, Padishar trusts him completely." "Maybe," Morgan muttered, sipping at his ale. "But Padishar was quick enough to ask about him when we got back here." Steph considered that a moment, then dismissed the matter. "There's more. They found a handful of guards at the cliff edge 2 days back. Night watch, The ones on the lifts, all dead. Their throats torn out. No sign of who did it." He looked away momentarily, then back again. Shadows darkened his eyes. "The baskets were all up, Morgan." They stared at each other. Morgan frowned. "So it was someone already here who did it?" "Don't know. Seems like. But what was the reason for it then? And if it was someone from the outside, how did they get up and then back down again with the baskets in place?" Morgan looked off into the shadows and thought about it, but no answers would come. Steph rose. "I thought you should know. Padishar will hear on his own, I expect." He drained his tankard. "I've got to get back to Teal. I don't like leaving her alone after what's happened. She's still awfully weak." He rubbed his forehead and grimaced. "I don't feel so well myself." "Off you go then," Morgan said, rising with him. "I'll come see you both in the morning. Right now, though, I'm in desperate need of about 2 days' sleep." He paused. "You know about the trolls?" "Know about them?" Steph gave him a wry smile. "I've spoken with them already. Axine and I go back a ways." Well, another mystery. Tell me about it tomorrow, will you?" Steph began moving away. "Tomorrow it is." He was almost out of sight when he said, "Better watch your back, Highlander." Morgan Lee had already decided as much. He slept well that night and woke rested. The mid-morning sun had crested the tree line and began to heat up the day. There was activity in the outlaw camp, more so than usual, and Morgan was immediately anxious to find out what was happening. He thought momentarily that the Valemen might have returned, but then discarded the possibility, deciding that he would have been awakened if they had. He pulled on his clothing and boots, rolled up his blankets, washed, ate, and went down to the bluff edge. He caught sight of Padishar immediately, dressed once more in his crimson garb, shouting orders and directing men this way and that. The outlaw chief glanced over as the Highlander approached and grunted. "I trust the noise didn't wake you." He turned to yell instructions to a gathering of men by the lift before continuing in a normal tone of voice. "I would hate to think you were disturbed." Morgan muttered something under his breath, but stopped when he caught a glimpse of the other's mocking grin. "Aha! Just teasing you a bit, Highlander," the other soothed. "Let's not begin the day on the wrong foot. There's too much that needs doing. I've sent scouts to sweep the Palmer Key to reassure myself that my neck hair's misled me about what's out there. And I've sent south for Hirehone. We will see what we will see. Meanwhile, the trolls await. Axine and his brood, close kin, a bunch of them. Yesterday was merely an overture. Today, we talk about the how and the wherefore of it all. You want to come along?" Morgan did, buckling on the scabbard that held the remains of the sword-of-lee, which he was carrying now mostly out of habit. He followed Padishar along the bluff face and then back toward the campsite where the trolls were already gathering. As they walked, he asked if there was any news of Par and Cole. There wasn't. He looked about expectantly for Steph and Teal, but there was no sign of either. He promised himself that he would seek them out later. When they reached the trolls, Axine embraced the outlaw chief, then greeted the Highlander with a solemn nod and a handclasp like iron, and beckoned them both to take seats. Moments later, Scions appeared with several companions, men Morgan didn't know, and the meeting got underway. It lasted the remainder of the morning and the better part of the afternoon. Once again, Morgan was unable to follow what was being said, and this time Shandos was too preoccupied with his own participation to worry about him. Morgan listened attentively, Nevertheless, studying the gestures and movements of the bearish trolls, trying to read something of what they were thinking behind their expressionless faces, he was mostly unsuccessful. They looked like great tree stumps brought to life and given the rudiments of human form to allow them to move about. Few did much of anything else. The other ones who spoke did so sparingly, even Axine. There was an economy of effort behind everything they did. Morgan wondered briefly what they were like in a fight, and decided that he probably already knew. The sun moved across the sky, changing the light from dim to bright and back again, erasing and then lengthening shadows, filling the day with heat and then letting it linger in a suffocating swelter that left everyone shifting uncomfortably in a futile search for relief. There was a short break for lunch, an exchange of ales and wines, and even a brief allusion to the Highlander that had something to do with the extent of the support that the movement enjoyed. Morgan stayed wisely silent during the exchange. He knew he had been brought there for support, not to contradict. The afternoon was waning when the runner appeared, winded and frightened looking. Padishar caught sight of him, frowned in annoyance at the interruption, and excused himself. He listened intently to what the runner had to say, hesitated, then glanced at the Highlander and beckoned. Morgan came to his feet in a hurry. He did not care for what he saw in Padishar Crill's face. Padishar dismissed the runner when Morgan reached them. "They found Hirehone," he said softly, evenly, "out along the west edge of the Palmer Quay, close to the path we followed on our return. He's dead." His eyes shifted uncomfortably. "The patrol that found him said he looked as if he had been turned inside out." Morgan felt his throat tighten at the image. "What's going on, Padishar?" he asked quietly. "Be sure you let me know when you figure it out, Highlander. Meantime, there's worse news still. My neck hairs never lie. There's a Federation army not 2 miles off. The garrison at Tursus, or I'm not my mother's favourite son." The hard face creased with lines of irony. "They're coming right for us, lad. Not a whit of deviation in their approach. Somehow, they've discovered where we are. And I guess we both know how that might have happened, don't we?" Morgan was stunned. "Who?" He barely breathed the word. Padishar shrugged and laughed softly. "Does it really matter now?" He glanced over his shoulder. "Time to finish up here. I don't relish telling Axine and his clan what's happened, but it wouldn't do to play games. If I were them, I'd disappear out of here faster than a hare gone to ground." The trolls were of a different mind, however, when the meeting broke up. Axine and his companions showed no inclination to leave. Instead, they requested their weapons back, an impressive collection of axes, pikes, and broadswords, and on receiving them, sat down and began in a leisurely fashion to sharpen the blades. It seemed as if they were looking for a fight. Morgan went off to find the dwarves. They were camped in a small, secluded grove of fir at the far end of the cliff base, where an outcropping of rock formed a natural shelter from the weather. Steph greeted him without much enthusiasm. Teal was sitting up, her strange masked face revealing nothing of her thoughts, though her eyes glittered watchfully. She looked stronger, her dusky hair brushed out, her hands steady as they accepted Morgan's own. He spoke with her briefly, but she said almost nothing in return. Morgan gave them the news of Hirehone and the approaching Federation army. Steph nodded soberly. Teal didn't even do that. He left them feeling vaguely dissatisfied with the entire visit. The Federation army arrived with the coming of nightfall, spread out in the forestlands directly below the cliffs of the Jut and began clearing the land for its use. Working with the industrious determination of ants, they streamed out the trees, several thousand strong, their pennants flying, their weapons gleaming. Standards were raised before each company, banners of solid black with one red and one white stripe. Where there were regular Federation soldiers and a grinning white wolf's head, where there were seekers, tents went up. Weapons racks were assembled, supplies were positioned to the rear, and fires sparked to life. Almost immediately, teams of men began building siege machines, and the sounds of saws felling trees and axes hewing limbs filled the air. The outlaws watched from the heights, their own fortifications already in place. Morgan watched with them. They seemed relaxed and easy. There were only 300 of them, but the Jut was a natural fortification that could resist an army 5 times the size of this one. The lifts had already been drawn to the bluff, and now there was no way up or down except by scaling the walls. That would require climbing by hand, ladder or grappling hook. Even a handful of men could put a stop to that. It was fully dark by the time Morgan was able to speak again with Padishar. They stood by the lifts, now under heavy guard, and looked out over the broad scattering of watchfires below. The men of the Federation continued to work, the sound of their building rising out of the darkened forest into the still night air. "I don't mind telling you that all this effort bothers me," the outlaw chief muttered, his brow furrowing. Morgan frowned with him. "Even with this siege equipment, how can they possibly hope to reach us?" "They can't. That's what bothers me." They watched a bit longer, then Padishar steered Morgan to a secluded part of the bluff, keeping him close as he whispered, "I needn't remind you that we've been betrayed twice now. Whoever's responsible is still out there, probably still among us. If the Jut's to be taken, that's my guess as to how it's to be done." He turned to Morgan, his strong, weathered face close. "I'll do my part to see that the Jut's kept secure, but you keep your eyes open as well, Highlander. You might see things differently from me, being fresh here. Maybe you'll see something I'll otherwise miss. Watch us all, and it's a big favour I'll owe you if you turn up something." Morgan nodded wordlessly. It gave him a purpose for being there, something he was beginning to suspect he lacked. He was consumed by the feeling of emptiness he had experienced on shattering his sword. He was distressed that he had been forced to leave Parr and Colt Olmsted behind. This charge, if nothing else, would give him something to concentrate on. He was grateful to Padishar for that. When they finished, he went to the armourer and asked to be given a broadsword. He picked one that suited him, withdrew his own broken sword, and replaced it with a new one. Then he hunted about for a discarded scabbard until he found one. The sword of Lee would fit. Cut the scabbard to the sword's shortened length, bound the severed end, and strapped the makeshift sheath carefully to his belt. He felt better about himself for the first time in days. He slept well that night too, even though the Federation continued to assemble its siege weapons until dawn. When the sun appeared, the building ceased. He woke them. The sudden stillness, disconcerting, pulled on his clothes, strapped on his weapons, and hurried down to the bluff edge. The outlaw was settling into place, arms at the ready. Padishar was there with Steph, Teal, and the contingent of trolls. All watched silently what was taking place below. The Federation army was forming up, squads into companies. They were well drilled, and there was no confusion as they marched into place. They circled the base of the Jut, stretching from one end of the cliffs to the other, their lines just out of range of longbow and sling. Scaling ladders and ropes with grappling hooks were piled next to them. Siege towers stood ready, though their towers were crude and scarcely a third of the height of the cliffs leading up. Commanders barked orders crisply, and the gaps between companies slowly began to fill. Morgan touched Steph briefly on the shoulder. The dwarf glanced about uncertainly, nodded without saying anything, and looked away again. Morgan frowned. Steph wasn't carrying any weapons. Trumpets sounded and the Federation lines straightened. Everything went still once more. Sunlight glinted off armour and weapons as the skies in the east brightened. Dew glistened off leaves and grasses. The bird songs lifted cheerfully. The sound of water running came from somewhere distant, and it seemed to Morgan Lee that it might have been any of the 1,000 mornings he had greeted when he still roamed and hunted the hills of his homeland. Then from back in the trees behind the long lines of soldiers, something moved. There was a jerking of limbs and trunks and a rasping of scraped bark. The Federation ranks suddenly split in two, opening a hole that was better than 100 feet across. The outlaws and their allies stiffened expectantly, frowns creasing their faces as the forest continued to shake the approach of whatever was hidden there. Shades, Morgan whispered to himself. The thing emerged from out of the fading shadows. It was huge, a creature of impossible size, an apparition composed of the worst bits and pieces of things scavengers might have left. It was formed out of hair and sinew and bone, but at the same time, of metal plates and bars. There were jagged ends and shiny surfaces, iron grafted onto flesh, flesh growing into iron. It had the look of a monstrous, misshapen crustacean or worm, but was neither. It shambled forward, its glistening eyes rolling upward to find the edge of the bluff. Pincers clicked like knives, and claws scraped heedlessly the roughened stone. For an instant, Morgan thought it was a machine. Then a heartbeat later, he realized it was alive. Demon's blood, Steph cried in recognition, his gruff voice angry and frightened. They've bought a creeper. Hunching its way slowly through the ranks of the Federation army, the creeper came for them.